Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of The Bible Unmuted. My name is Matthew Halstead. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast is all about carefully engaging scripture as an ancient text that offers timeless truth. And so I hope you find today's episode to be thought-provoking and encouraging. On today's episode, we're looking at Revelation chapter 21, verses 9 through 27. This is a rich text, just like all the other passages we've explored thus far in Revelation. It's going to take us back to the Old Testament and many different corners of the Old Testament. So we'll be taken back to Exodus, Ezekiel. We're also going to look at First Kings, and we're also going to see a parallel passage that'll be very important from Ephesians. So once again, Revelation is giving us many echoes back to the Old Testament text. The imagery, the worldview of the Old Testament is going to be in this passage as well. So we need to keep our ears open for all of these allusions and echoes because they are everywhere in Revelation, and we want to keep track of them. If we want to understand what John is saying and what John is seeing, then we have to have a good inventory of concepts taken from the Old Testament as well. All right, well, let's just jump into this. Let's begin by looking at verses 9 and 10. So in verse 9, we see that John encounters once again one of the seven angels who carried the bowls that we saw in a previous passage in Revelation. And one of these seven angels tells John, quote, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And by the way, if you are only listening to this episode, you might want to come back later and watch it on Spotify or YouTube, because on the screen, I have several different Bible translations. I've got the CSB, the NIV, NRSV, the ESV, the Lexham English Bible, and of course, the Greek New Testament, all up on the screen so that you can compare and contrast the different ways in which these texts are translated. So reading from the CSB, once again, the angel says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." It goes on and says, "He then carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, from out of heaven from God. And it's arrayed with God's glory." All right, so the first thing that we see here is how the city is called the wife of the Lamb. And this is very important because the city here represents the people of God, the community of God, the church, the believers, the sons and daughters of God. But the imagery, the metaphor is actually that of a bride. And so as you know, the imagery adjusts itself in different ways depending on the context. And here the primary mode of communication is to depict the people of God as the bride of the Lamb. This is the community of God. And so why does scripture do this? Well, I think it's important to keep in mind the larger narrative piece here. As you'll recall from chapter 17 and chapter 18, we encountered the great harlot, which represented Rome, the Roman imperial system, primarily the economic system of the Roman Empire. And as you'll recall also, we talked about how the imagery of the great harlot probably represented the goddess Roma, which was the image, the token image of the Roman system. And so here we have two contrasting visions. The great harlot represents the Roman economic exploitation system, and here we have the church of God, the community of believers, described as a bride. And this bride is beautiful and stunning, and it presents to readers a sharp contrast. And it's a moral contrast. Whereas Rome is evil and wicked and exploitative, the church is beautiful and blameless and spotless and morally pure. And so you'll see this imagery pull through in different ways because the city is depicted as being laced in gold. The city is functioning properly. It's beautiful. It's stunning. And so anyway, we can't miss the imagery here. And the reason I say that is because the point, it seems, is that John's vision is offering competing political visions, right? So whereas on the one hand, the Roman imperial system has been exploitative and unjust and so forth, the political entity called the church is the exact opposite, okay? And so, in the Western part of the world today, in the modern world, especially if you live in the United States, there's this tendency to separate the religious from the political. Well, we have to keep in mind our own bias here because in the ancient world, especially in John's world, the religious and the political went hand in hand. They could not have been separated precisely because they both infused the ways of life for people living in the first century. Separating the political and the theological is largely an Enlightenment assumption. It's a modern way of thinking, and it has no real commonality with the ancient world. And so we need to keep that in mind. And so, what I would like to suggest to you, what I would like to propose, is that this is a political text. It's offering two different systems of living, two different ways of life, two different modes of being. The political system of Rome has faltered, it has been defeated, but the political system called the church remains and it lasts forever. Whereas Rome boasted about being an eternal city, it's actually the city of God that lasts for all eternity. And so when you have to choose between these two ways of living, between the beast, between the dragon, between the ways of the great harlot and the economic exploitative system that Rome represents, when you choose between that and the church, between that and the ways of God and the ways of the Lamb, the ways of Jesus, you have to go with the ways of Jesus because that path, that way of living, that mode of being is what will last for all eternity. So, in this sense, it's a political offer. It's a political contrast, and it's an offer to all people. And the only question that Revelation poses to us is which will we choose? And I think this is highly relevant for today's world because in today's world, we see a lot of the same elements that plagued the Roman imperial system. Today, we have modern versions of ancient empires that boast about its military strength, its economic powers, and its ability to manipulate and control the world. And this is a system that's very appealing to people, just as it was in the ancient world. But Revelation offers to modern people the same offer it made to ancient people, namely, come out from these systems and give your life over to the ways of the Lamb. Give your life over to the Lamb and be partners with the Lamb in being truly human. I think that's what's on offer here is namely an invitation to be part of the new creation, to get humanity back on track with the humanity that God originally planned. A life of flourishing, a life of abundance, a life that was the opposite of selfishness and exploitation, a life that gave to others, a life that overflowed with the glory of God and in truth, goodness, and beauty. And so that's exactly what we see in contrasting these two cities. And again, the question is, which will we choose? Now, as we move on to verse 11, you can see this on the screen. It says that this holy city, the New Jerusalem, it is arrayed with or in God's glory. It has the glory of God. Now, I think this is very important to stop and pause and reflect upon because this reminds us of the vision that Ezekiel, the Old Testament prophet, it reminds us of the vision that he had when he saw the debauchery and the abominations that were happening in the temple of his day. So if you go back to Ezekiel chapter 8, and you read 8, 9, and 10 and thereabouts, you'll see that Ezekiel, he also has a vision of a temple. He has a vision of something going on in the Jerusalem of his day. And what he sees is something that is truly disheartening. It was a vision of seeing priests and leaders of the religious establishment. They were compromising their faith, they were worshiping false gods, and all of these sorts of things were happening on the temple grounds. And this is the height of blasphemy. It's taking that which is evil and inserting it into sacred space. And so the glory of the temple in Ezekiel 8 in Jerusalem, it actually departs from the temple based upon and because of the sins of the people. And this is something that Ezekiel sees. He sees it in his vision. Now, contrast that with what John sees here in Revelation 21. He sees a new Jerusalem that has no evil within it. In fact, it is pure in such a way that the glory of God can reside within the Jerusalem city itself. This is in stark contrast yet again to the old temple and the old vision that Ezekiel had. And so I think what we see here is an echo back to Ezekiel chapter 8. You just need to go back and read Ezekiel 8, 9, and 10, and you'll see some of these these similar, but yet contrasting images of what's going on. And in short, what we can say is, for John, in his vision of the eschaton, God's glory remains with his purified people, whereas before God's glory departed from the temple because of sin. But the sin problem has been taken care of. The powers of darkness have been defeated, and the enemies of God have been defeated. And so God's peace, his truth, goodness, and beauty can remain upon his people. All right, so then we move on to verses 12 through 14. Okay, so this is a neat vision here, a neat part or neat aspect of the vision. I'm going to go ahead and read from the CSB. I've got it handy here. I'm going to read verses 12 through 14. It says, "The city had a massive high wall with 12 gates. 12 angels were at the gates. The names of the 12 tribes of Israel's sons were inscribed on the gates. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 gates on the north, 3 gates on the south, and 3 gates on the west. The city wall had 12 foundations. And the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb were on the foundations." Okay, so here we see the highly symbolic and meaning layered idea or concept of the number 12, right? Numbers are very, very important in the book of Revelation. You have the number 7, 144,000. You have 666, and here you have, of course, 12. And we've already run into this number previously when we looked at 12,000 and 144,000 in Revelation 7 and Revelation 14. And so here we see yet further imagery with the number 12. And specifically, here we have 12 gates to the city. There are 12 gates described as being as part of the city structure, but on each gate, the name of each of the 12 apostles, or I'm sorry, the 12 tribes are inscribed on each of the gates, right? And so what is this meant to convey? Well, I think it's important because we see, or at least I'm reminded of this when I think about John chapter 4, where Jesus tells the woman at the well that salvation is of the Jews. And so here, the fact that there are 12 tribes, the names of each tribe inscribed on each of the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem, reminds the reader that the path toward the New Jerusalem is founded upon and it comes through or comes via the people of Israel, right? As you'll recall, and I've said this a lot on the podcast, this is something that N.T. Wright talks a lot about. He's kind of known for this way of thinking, but the idea is that Israel is God's rescue plan for the world. Genesis 3 through 11 records the downfall of humanity, but Genesis 12, the very next episode after the Tower of Babel, you see the calling of Abraham. And it is through Abraham's family that the blessing will come back to the nations. Why do the nations need to be blessed? Well, because just prior to the calling of Abraham in Genesis 12, you have the downfall, the cursing of humanity in Genesis 11. Humanity is fractured and broken, but Israel is elected and called to go out to retrieve the non-elect and to be a blessing to the non-elect. And so the idea, as N.T. Wright says, is that Israel is God's rescue plan for the world. Now, of course, Israel shows herself unable to rescue the world because she too is in sin, and so she needs to be rescued, which is why, by the way, in Isaiah, you have this talk of a servant who's going to show up. The servant is Israel, but the servant will also rescue Israel. And so here, of course, we know that the servant is Jesus. The Gospels, such as in Mark and Philippians chapter 2, talk about Jesus as a servant. And so anyway, lots to be said about that. But I think as we come full circle, we need to remember that Jesus, he is a Jew, right? And he comes as a son of David. He is a child of Abraham, and it is through the Jewish family that the world is rescued. And we see this in remembrance, in wonderful remembrance, inscribed upon the New Jerusalem structure itself. Now, granted, this is a vision, but we can't miss the aspects of the vision. The actual architecture speaks something very profound, and it's on the gates that the names of the 12 tribes of Israel's sons were inscribed. I think that's important. Now, gates are things you go through, right? And so salvation is comes about through the Jews, right? And so I think this is a very important imagery. But that's not the only thing going on here. In verse 14, it says that the city wall had foundations, had 12 foundations. And the 12 apostles, each of their names were inscribed on the 12 foundations of the city. Now, what does this mean? Well, I think this is highly important because what we see with the 12 apostles is Jesus gathering the people of Israel together under his 12 leaders, right? These 12 apostles are given great authority. They are even called in the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 20. They are called the foundation. It's the teaching of the apostles that's the foundation of the church. And so you have similar language here. In fact, I think I have this pulled up. No, I don't. I'm sorry, but you'll have to go and look up Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20. The apostles play a very integral role in the establishment of the church. They, in other words, continue the long story of the 12 patriarchs. And Jesus, in a sense, reconstitutes the story of Israel. He doesn't erase the story of Israel, he reconstitutes it and then fulfills it in himself. Jesus is the Israel, and his 12 apostles are, in a sense, you might say, the 12 foundations or the continuation of the 12 tribes. It's a beautiful portrait, the ways in which the New Testament builds upon and continues, not erases, but continues the story of Israel. And so what you have here is a reminder of this fact that the 12 apostles continue the 12 patriarchal stories and the salvation that God is bringing about through his people Israel. Lots to be said about that, but I hope that connects a lot of dots for you, and it's worth thinking about and musing on. And there are lots of other texts in the Old Testament and the New Testament that reinforces what I'm saying here. Hey everyone, I want to interrupt for just a moment to say thank you to all our supporters on Patreon. As a listener-supported podcast, a Patreon membership helps to keep everything up and running. Thank you so much for your partnership. If you're interested in learning how you can support the show, visit our Patreon page. Every supporter gets access to a ton of bonus content, from blogs, videos, book giveaways, to monthly meetings. It's all there, so check it out. Visit patreon.com/thebibleunmuted or click the link in the description for this episode. Thank you for your prayers each and every week and your support each and every month. It helps me do what I do. All right, friends, let's get back to today's discussion. Okay, so let's move on to verses 15 through 21. In verse 15, we see how John encounters an angel who has a golden measuring rod. And the job with the task for this measuring rod is to measure the city, to measure its gates, and to measure its wall. Now, here's the thing. This immediately reminds the careful reader of Ezekiel chapter 40 just chapter 40 through chapter 42. And it's there where an angel measures the new temple that Ezekiel sees in his vision. And so, again, you see this echo, this pulling you back to the stories of Israel, specifically to the eschatological vision that the prophet Ezekiel had. So lots of work can be done and lots of comparisons can be made with respect to that vision. We don't have time to go into Ezekiel's new temple, but it's a highly detailed vision, and there's a lot to be said about that. But I think what we see here is a fulfillment of that vision, namely the people of God, the community of God, is a fulfillment of all the hopes and the dreams that Ezekiel saw. Even if Ezekiel saw his vision dimly, and he wasn't, he wasn't privy to all the facts of the matter. Nonetheless, the entirety of his vision goes a long way in helping us to realize the depth of God's faithfulness. Then we move to verse 16. Now, this is a fascinating text. It says here that the New Jerusalem is a cube. Now, this is very interesting. It's not. It's got similar. Its length, its width, and its height have the same length, or the same. What word am I looking for? Its length, width, and height are equal in distance. Let's just say that. And this comes out to, when you do the math, it comes out to about 1,500 miles in length, width, and height. Now, this is a staggering, crazy, stunning, amazing mega structure. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, commentators describe it in all sorts of different ways. Just call it a mega structure. And the reason we would call it that is because this thing extends well past the clouds, right? I mean, this goes into outer space, right? It's massive, 1,500 miles tall. I mean, can you imagine this? 1,500 miles wide, 1,500 miles in length. What do we do with this? Well, the first thing that we need to highlight is to remind ourselves of a passage in the Old Testament, namely 1 Kings chapter 6. Now, it's in that passage where Solomon's temple is being described. All the details, all the furniture, the architecture, everything is laid out in a very careful way. And what we read there is that in actually in Jerusalem, you have the temple structure, but you also have within the temple, in the most sacred part of the temple, this place called the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. It's the innermost chamber of the temple. It's the most sacred space in the temple. And anyway, we read in First Kings chapter 6, verse 20, how this place is a cube. It's actually structured 20 cubits in height, 20 cubits in length, and 20 cubits in width. And it's also layered in gold. Now, the reason I mention this is because a number of commentators are going to point to how the New Jerusalem, as it is a cube, it is meant to reflect and mirror and bring us back to this story of the most holy place in the temple. So what's the meaning in all of this? Well, I think the idea is that at the eschaton, in the end, when God makes all things new, what he's going to do is be with his people in a very close way. As you know, in the temple, in the Old Testament system, the high priest could only go into the holy place once a year. It was a sacred place. You had to do everything very carefully, because that's where the presence of God was. And so the basic idea in Revelation is that God will be with his people in that way, with all of his people, not just with one person once a year. All right. And so the idea is that God's Holy of Holies has expanded. It has become a mega structure. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a literal 1,500 miles wide. Again, I think most of this here is highly symbolic language. I don't think we can do much with it in terms of a literal interpretation. We have to. We can't get caught up in the symbol. We have to use the symbol in the way that's intended, and look through the symbol. We have to look through the symbol. It's kind of like a window. If you have windows in your house and all you do is look at the window and not through the window, then what you're doing is something contrary to the purpose of windows. Windows are meant to give you a view to some other reality outside of your own location. Okay, so the symbolism of Revelation, specifically the cube-like structure of the New Jerusalem, and the height and the length and the width and so forth and so on, all of those things are windows. They're meant to be looked through. And so the point here is just that God, in his Holy of Holies, his most sacred space, will be, it'll fill up the entire city. It'll fill up the entire community of God. God's people will be close to him in a very endearing way. I don't know how else to put it, but I think you get my point. Now, what's interesting about this is that something that Keener says in his commentary, he likens this to a kind of a counter story. How does he put it? I'm kind of confusing my words here. He contrasts this New Jerusalem and the cube-like structure with the Tower of Babel, whereas in Genesis 11, humans came together in an act of hubris, as an act of arrogance and pride, came together and wanting to build a tower to the heavens. And so that's when God fractured humanity and basically said, look, you guys can't do this. And he frustrated their plans by confusing their language. But here, this community of God, the people upon whom the Holy Spirit has come, and we can understand each other, i.e. Pentecost, which is the reversal of Babel. Anyway, here the community of God is being gifted, Keener says, with the very thing that humans tried to get in Genesis 11, namely a connection with the heavens. And the New Jerusalem offers people that connection. And I think there's a lot actually here. If it's 1,500 miles in height, I mean, we're reaching clear into the heavens. This is a lot higher, presumably, than the Genesis 11 Tower of Babel tried to become. So anyway, I think you get my point. I think Keener's actually right here. I think this connection to the tower is there, and I think that's part of the ramifications of what it means to follow God. You get good gifts when you follow God, and anyway, lots more to be said about that. Now, in verse 17, we get some information about the wall of the city. It's measured to be 144 cubits. And I think there's some debate about, is this in terms of its width, in terms of its height. I think most commentators are probably going to say the width, but I'm not sure. Anyway, but again, we can't get caught up with the symbolism. We have to look through it. So what's important about this is the number 144. Where have we seen that number before? Well, we've seen it previously in Revelation, specifically with the 144,000. Now, as you recall, my interpretation of that was that the 144,000, that group of people, that's the church. It's a symbolic way of describing the church. And something, again, going back to Keener, something he says, I don't think he says it in his commentary, and forgive me, I'm going off memory here, but I think in one of his online videos or lectures, he talks about how the people, he connects the 144,000, the church as described there as 144,000, he connects it to the actual structure of the temple. And this isn't necessarily unique to him, but I like the way he described it. Is like the 144,000 are the New Jerusalemites. I think that's how he describes it. Forgive me if I'm getting something wrong here, but I think his quote there is, they are the New Jerusalemites. They are the people of New Jerusalem, because the New Jerusalem has, it's built into the structure of being 144. And it would make sense to call them 144,000. At least the connection there would be so obvious, I think, to the first century reader that we just can't afford to miss it. I think there is a connection there. Anyway, I'm blabbing too much here. I hope that makes sense. Now, in verse 18, we see how the city is made of pure gold, right? I think this gold idea is meant to describe the purity of the city, that there's no stain in it, that there's nothing unworthy in it, that there's nothing cheap in it, but it's actually all so valuable. And remember, it's the city that is the people of God. Okay, and so what this is describing is how the people of God are perfected. The people of God themselves are glorified. They are goldified, I guess you could say, too. But this is the idea that they are made new completely because they are in union with Jesus. Okay, and so, let's move on down to a very, very fascinating part of this text where it talks about the foundations of the city wall. Now, the text says, and I'm going to go ahead and read verses 19 and 20. Let's see. Let's just read from the NIV. It says, the foundations of the city walls were decorated with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth ruby, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th turquoise, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. All right, so you have 12 jewels that are in this, and they're all named. Each of the 12 jewels are named, but this is part of the decor of the foundations of the city walls. Now, what do we do with this? This is very interesting. Well, there's some debate among scholars what to do with this. I think the first thing we can say about this is that it's meant to echo back to something described in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 28, if you read verses 15 through 30, what you'll see there is you get a description of the priestly vestments. In other words, what the priest in the Old Testament would wear. Now, when it's describing the breastplate of the priest, this breastplate is described as containing 12 stones. And so there are four rows of 3 stones. And on each of these stones is the name of one of the 12 sons of Israel. So again, this is Exodus chapter 28. Just for the sake of time, I won't read the whole thing, but I just offer that to you to go back and look at later and compare and contrast what's going on here. So is there a connection with that? It's quite possible, because what you could say is that the city or the people of God are being described here as priests. That if the bride is depicted as a city coming down from heaven, I think what we could say is that the people have become priests, and this is the very hope of the Old Testament, and it's the idea of the priesthood of all believers, that we all have direct access to God, and that we are His communicators, His image bearers, and so forth and so on. And so is that what is going on? In other words, could we interpret this as John's vision communicating something along the lines of how the Old Testament priestly system is being enfleshed in the church, right? It's being um, it's being fulfilled in the church. I think that works, in my opinion, right? I mean, especially when you look at the 12 apostles and the sorts of things the 12 apostles are given in terms of authority and things like that, and how the 12 apostles are the foundation of the church, and how they serve as the basis for the church's teaching and so forth and so on. There's a lot to be said about this. It even gets into ecclesiology when you look at John chapter 20 and the church being granted, specifically the apostles being granted the authority to absolve sins and that kind of things like that. Lots to be said about that. We'll set that aside for the moment. But anyway, I think a connection can be made back to the priestly vestments here. And another thing that's brought up, in this is mentioned, as I recall, in GB Caird's commentary, and probably every commentary is going to mention this. But also Kirk Keener talks about this. But anyway, a connection could also be made, arguably, with a passage out of Ezekiel chapter 28. And this is a well-known passage. And again, for the sake of time, we won't go through it all. But that's where Tyre is being discussed, and the idea is that Tyre, by the way, is a sort of proto-Babylon. And so so what Keener does with this is he basically says that Tyre's economic prowess, I forget the way Keener actually puts it, but I'm just going off my memory here, but Tyre's economic prowess and their exploitative practices and so forth, which, by the way, yet again is exemplified in Rome, or via Rome. All of those things are meant to contrast with the New Jerusalem. And so actually, I'm just going to read this because I'm not explaining it well. My bad. So let's look at Ezekiel 28. And by the way, this is the famous cherub passage and so forth, but the context is definitely Tyre. So if you look at Ezekiel 28, it says, "And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, say to the leader of Tyre, thus says the Lord Yahweh, because your heart was haughty, and you said, I am a god, I sit in the seat of the gods, I sit in the heart of the seas. But you are a human, not a god, and you gave your heart to be like the heart of a god." And then I'm just going to go down. That was verses 1-2, but let me just go on down. So here what we see is the king of Tyre is being denounced for his pride and arrogance and so forth. If I go on down to, say, verse 11, it says, "And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Son of man, raise a lament over the king of Tyre, and you must say to him, Thus says the Lord Yahweh, you were a perfect model of an example, full of wisdom and perfect of beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God, and every precious stone was your adornment: carnelian, topaz, and moonstone, turquoise, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, malachite, and emerald, and gold was the craftsmanship of your settings and your mountings in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared." So let's see. Let me just go back to verse 14. It says, "You were an anointed guardian cherub, and I placed on you God's holy mountain. You walked in the midst of stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day when you were created until wickedness was found in you. In the abundance of your trading, they filled the midst of you with violence, and you sinned, and I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I expelled you, the guardian cherub, in the midst of the stones of fire," or from the midst of the stones of fire. "Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You ruined your wisdom because of your splendor. I threw you on the ground before kings. I have exposed you for viewing. From the abundance of your iniquities and the dishonesty of your trading, I profaned your sanctuaries, and I brought fire from your midst." So the context is that this is a denouncement of the king of Tyre for his pride and arrogance. But notice again in verse 13 how he is adorned in jewels, right? And so now, of course, there's lots of debate and lots of discussion, and this is a good thing. I think there's merit to these sorts of debates about, is this talking about some sort of Satan figure? Or is it, strictly speaking, a human, or is it both? I don't want to wade into those waters today. All I want to say, though, is that Tyre is being denounced for its pride. Even it was adorned in these sorts of jewels of beauty and so forth. And so I bring all this up because what Keener does with this passage is he says, again, as I recall going from memory here, Keener says that a connection with the New Jerusalem and it's being adorned in 12 jewels is meant to be a counter political city of sorts to the pride and arrogance that we see here about the king of Tyre. Okay. And if I'm not mistaken, Keener would draw from both the Exodus and the Ezekiel text. In other words, he's going to say that these 12 stones are echoing back to the priestly vestments as well as to the denouncement of the pride and arrogance of the king of Tyre. So what you get in the composite picture of Revelation 21 is that the New Jerusalem is a city of not economic exploitation like the king of Tyre or like the kingdom of Tyre, but it's a place of fairness. It's a place of justice. It's a place where such evils and debauchery are never to be found. It's an alternative political entity, in other words. I don't think Keener puts it like that, but I think he would agree with it. So I think both of these things make sense. I think alluding back to the Exodus passage as well as to the Ezekiel passage, it makes sense to me. All right, I hope that helps. So when you look at the last passage here, verses 22 down to 27, we see how John's vision notices something not there, namely a physical temple. So if you're looking for a physical temple at the eschaton, you're not going to have it because it's not there. He says, I did not see a temple. And by that, he means a physical temple. Because then he goes on to say that the temple that is there is actually the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. Okay. So there is a temple, but the temple is, what's a temple for? It's for housing and being a location for the sacred presence of God. But here in the New Jerusalem, God is in the midst of all of his people. And so in a sense, he is the temple. And I find it interesting here that the temple language is in the singular, but here you have the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb, these two distinct entities, if you will. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, I think because it speaks about the essential unity of the Godhead, right? I mean, I'm a good Trinitarian, so I've got to bring this up, and I apologize. Well, actually, I don't apologize for bringing this up, but I think that the idea here is that there's an essential unity that we can see between these two members of the Trinity, Jesus the Son and God the Father, right? So you have one essence, distinct persons. And this is something that the creeds will go on to say. And, I know that when it comes to biblical studies, a lot of biblical scholars don't like to look at the creeds, but I do. I love the creeds. I'm a good Anglican priest. And so, of course, this is going to be something that I can't resist bringing up. So here you see the essential unity, but arguably maybe you can make the case for a distinction in persons in this text. And then you also see how in verse 23, how the glory of God is described as light and the Lamb is described as a lamp. And so again, you have the God the Father and God the Son working together in blissful, perfect unity. Like they're not opposed. There's not like opposing wills or anything like that, right? But what you have here is the beautiful, the true, good, and beautiful outworking of the great plan of God and his redemption. It's a beautiful thing. So yeah, lots to be said about all of that, but I'm just going to leave that with you because I think it's here in the text. I think we can see that quite clearly. If you're interested in the creeds, I highly recommend go read the Nicene Creed. Go read the Nicene Creed. It's just beautiful language. It captures all of that's in the Bible with respect to the Godhead, and it's just beautiful work from our own church fathers, and it's a gift to us as a church. And so I highly recommend not only just reading it once, but reciting it weekly. And maybe if you're a pastor in your church, this is something that you could do, is to recite the creed as a family as your congregation. Recite the creed because this is our faith. Recite the Apostles' Creed, right? That's such a beautiful creed as well. All right, so yeah. Anyway, lots more to say about the creeds, but I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so then in verses 24 to 26, we have this idea of how the nations will walk by the light of God and that they will bring their glory into the gates, into the city. And I think the idea here is that the nations are bringing their gifts, their tribute. And this is just another way of describing or depicting how the nations are recognizing the fact that there is only one Lord worthy of worship. Okay, so what you see here is in deep contrast to the way the world is structured today, in deep contrast to the way the world was structured in the ancient era, in ancient eras, I should say. There's a unity among people that everybody's recognizing the one lordship of Christ. In the end, every knee will bow and confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And so I think we're getting a glimpse of something like that. Now, this is not a forced sort of thing. It seems like they are walking in the light of God. And so these are redeemed people, it seems, who are coming into the gates. In fact, it actually says that its gates will never close there. They bring their glory into it. And then verse 27 says, nothing unclean will ever enter into it. Right. And so, the people who do enter into it are those who are renewed. Again, this is apocalyptic imagery, and there's lots we can say about this text, but I think this is the general idea of what's going on. Okay, now there is this part here which says the gates never close. And there's no more night there. It says that its gates will never close by day because it will never be night there. Now, what's this idea about the gates never being closed? A lot of exegetes are going to have a lot of different things to say about this. And I know, there's just a lot here, and I don't want to get into all the debates, right? But I think it's actually just real simple what's being conveyed here. Here, the symbolism of the gates always being open. I think it speaks to how in the new creation, there is no longer fear of any enemy, because the reason you closed your gates in the ancient world is, of course, to keep things out, right? You wanted to keep the enemy out. And here there is no enemy. There is nothing to threaten the people of God. Whereas in the Old Testament, the people of God were always being threatened. And in the New Testament, the people of God were being persecuted. But here at the eschaton, the vision is that one day the people of God will live in peace and in bliss and in perfect harmony. And there will be no more fear of any enemy threatening the existence of the church or anything like that. The people are going to dwell in safety because they dwell in the midst of the presence of God. And so I think this whole idea of night being banished is meant to help us to interpret this idea of the gates being open and never being closed. I mean, typically you close the gates at nighttime so that you could sleep, and your watchers and so forth weren't many at night, although you did have people guarding at night, but most people are asleep. But because there's no night, in other words, because there's no darkness, because there's no evil, there's no need to guard the city, right? There's no need to ever close the gates. And this is just simply saying that there's no more enemy. All right. And I think that's the simple way of interpreting this picture. Probably there's a lot more that we can say about this, but I think that's the gist of it. And I don't, I never want to overread or read too much into a text. I certainly don't want to read too little out of the text, but I think here this is the gist of what's going on. So there's a lot to look forward to in terms of the eschaton, and here we get a glimpse of it. We get images, a foretaste, a little bit of glimpsing of the peace and the true goodness and beauty that comes down from heaven as a gift for those who say yes to Jesus. And again, it all goes back to the offer that God puts on the table. He's saying to people, look, will you follow the ways of Rome and the political entity that Rome represents and the political entity that Rome insists on being? Will you go with that way? Well, if you do, the end of that way of living is death and destruction and actually self-implosion. But if you want to follow the ways of Christ, then you will inherit the true and lasting eternal city. You will live in a city in perfect peace and bliss and harmony with other people. And most importantly, you'll live at peace with God, and you will fear nothing else, because nothing else will exist to cause you to fear. Nothing evil will exist to cause you to fear, because evil has been dealt with, injustice has been vanquished, and the only thing that is left is the truth and the goodness and beauty of God himself. Well, friends, that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, consider rating it on your podcast platform, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends as well. You can also support the podcast by becoming a Patreon member. Go to patreon.com/thebibleunmuted or click the link in the description for this episode. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, friends.